Israel Defense Forces are continuing its large-scale airstrikes against Hamas militants in the Gaza Strip. And as the world leaders attempt to bring both the parties back to the negotiating table. Under the Israel bombings, around 700 Palestinians have been killed, and people are fleeing their homes now. The paramount question being, where do Gazans go? To talk more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Malcolm Davis, senior analyst in defense strategy, and he's joining us live from Australia. Thanks very much for joining us on WION, Dr. Davis.
My pleasure.
Right, and Dr. Davis, as things stand in the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, Israel has launched an all-out ground operation in Gaza with an aim to eliminate Hamas, while on the other hand, Hamas has made it extremely clear that there will be no hostage or prisoner exchange until the bombings in Gaza stops. How do you assess the current situation in Gaza, and do you expect that the truce will restart again?
In terms of the truce starting again, absolutely not. I think that what is clear is that the truce collapsed because Hamas essentially violated it. They started reducing the number of hostages they were going to hand over, at the same time started launching rockets into Israel. And I think Israel was entirely justified in essentially ending the truce and starting the war. In terms of where it goes from here, I think that you will see Israel continue its war into the south of Gaza. Their goal is to eliminate Hamas as a fighting force, to eliminate the Hamas leadership, including in areas outside of Gaza, and to make sure that Hamas never again is able to threaten Israel in the way that it did on October the 7th. So Israel has to continue the war. For Hamas, they will continue to threaten Israeli forces and launch attacks on Israeli territory. But really, it's going to be very difficult ultimately for Hamas to hold Israeli forces back. I think the challenge going forward is for Israel to avoid creating more opposition to its attacks by causing unnecessary civilian casualties. And that's an entirely different issue, which I think Israel needs to confront.
I was just coming to that, the point you made there about the Israeli casualties. At the moment, around 700 Palestinians have been killed in the last 24 hours. And the United States earlier said that Israel is receptive to the U.S. messaging on minimizing civilian casualties. But how possibly can Israel execute that, especially in the congested southern part of the Strip, of the Gaza Strip?
Look, I think Israel, in principle, of course, seeks to avoid civilian casualties. No one, except maybe Hamas, seeks to deliberately attack civilians in harm's way. So Israel is trying its best to avoid civilian casualties, but as you quite correctly put out, the geographic nature of Gaza and the tightly constrained terrain, the closed-in urban environment in which large numbers of civilians are sheltering, make it virtually impossible for Israel to advance forward and to launch attacks on Hamas without causing civilian casualties. Hamas understands this, and they are using civilians as human shields. In Hamas's perspective, they actually want civilians to be killed because that helps them. So I think that there is a real challenge here in terms of, on the one hand, Israel in principle recognizing and supporting that call by the United States to avoid civilian casualties, but in a practical sense, at the tactical level, on the battlefield, it becomes virtually impossible for Israel to achieve its objectives without causing civilian casualties. And unfortunately, there's no military technological solution that allows them to achieve that goal. So it is a problem going forward.
Right. In a bid to minimize the civilian casualties, the IDF, they have been announcing evacuation orders in Gaza. They have been throwing leaflets as well. The IDF had earlier asked Gazans to evacuate the northern part of the Strip and then move towards south. And now we are seeing that the IDF has intensified its ground operations in southern part of Gaza. So the paramount question that arises here is that where do Gazans go?
Well, I think, to be honest, Hamas should allow them to move south through the Rafah crossing into Egypt. into the Sinai, out of harm's way. Unfortunately, Hamas is not going to do that. The best the Israelis can do, I think, is try to minimize the use of artillery strikes and airstrikes and go in on the ground with infantry forces and basically hunt down Hamas forces with infantry, in other words, troops on the ground. That, of course, puts their troops at greater risk. It also means that maybe there are targets that the IDF cannot go after because the Hamas fighters are well ensconced in tightly controlled defensive positions. So it makes it more difficult at a tactical level for the Israelis to achieve their goals and puts more of their troops at risk of taking fire. But that would be the only way for the Israelis to advance south without causing massive civilian casualties. And I think that the US Secretary of Defense made it very clear that the risk is that Israel turns a tactical victory into a strategic defeat if they cause large numbers of civilian casualties.
Right, you list out the challenges that the Israeli military faces at the moment. Another major challenge that the IDF faces is Gaza's tunnel network. In the latest, the Israeli military has found around 800 shafts and says that it has destroyed 50% of it. How do you think that the IDF will navigate through the tunneling network of Gaza?
With great difficulty. Those tunnels are very dark, they're very tight. They're probably well laid out with booby traps and mines and so forth. So it's an extremely dangerous environment to be in. I would imagine the Israelis might try and use drones to go into the tunnels to try and find enemy forces rather than going straight in with troops. But ultimately, troops do have to go in to secure the tunnels. The alternative is they blow up the tunnels, which means artillery and therefore civilian casualties. So if the Israelis are trying to avoid the civilian casualties, they have to put themselves in harm's way, and that means going into the tunnels directly and exposing themselves to that risk.
Right, and speaking of the recent attack by Yemen's Houthis on commercial vessels in the Red Sea, talk to us about the growing maritime tensions in the West Asian region.
Well, you do have this risk of escalation from what is currently an Israeli-Hamas war into a broader regional war that has been present since the beginning of the conflict. Iran is responsible for supporting the Houthis as well as supporting other radical Palestinian and Islamic groups across the region that are attacking US forces, not just at sea, but also in Iraq and Syria. The US response to these attacks has been primarily defensive, and where retaliation has occurred, it's been very limited and very precise. The problem of that, of course, is that whilst that avoids escalation, it doesn't deter Iran from continuing to coordinate these attacks on US and allied forces. So the risk is that at some point an attack will get through and cause loss of life or significant damage to a US or allied interest. And then the Americans will have to respond much more forcefully. And that's where the danger of escalation comes in. But certainly, as we saw at sea, the Houthis launched a range of missiles and drones, not only at a US destroyer, but also against civilian shipping. The US destroyer defended that civilian shipping. And we should expect more of these attacks until the US can find some way to deter them without creating unavoidable escalation risk.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Dr. Davis, for taking our time and joining us here on WION yet again. Thanks very much.
Thank you.